Sometimes the loudest echoes of war aren't found in gunfire, but in the silence that follows a promise. An old man's trembling hand reached for a medal that wasn't his, but carried the soul of a friend lost decades ago. When no one moved, a soldier did. Against protocol, against tradition, he stepped forward, not out of duty, but out of love, memory, and a promise too sacred to be left lying on cold stone. What followed stunned a crowd, shook a nation, and reminded us all that true honor isn't about standing still. It's about knowing when to move. "Hey, old man, you dropped your fake little badge." The teenager's voice was sharp and loud, cutting through the summer air like a knife, dripping with mockery. The smirk on his face wasn't just for Frank Riley. It was for the crowd, meant to invite their laughter. And some did laugh. Frank stopped cold. His cane quivered in his grip as he bent slightly, his eyes fixed on the object now lying at his feet. It wasn't fake, it wasn't little. That small piece of bronze had cost more than most could ever understand. It was a bronze star, earned not for himself, but for the friend he had watched fall beside him. The friend whose blood had soaked into foreign soil so that others could come home. The sound of laughter pierced deeper than any bullet ever had. It cut through the years, through the silence, through the decades of trying to forget. The sidewalk of Arlington grew heavy with silence. Strangers stood still, watching, uncomfortable, unsure, but no one stepped in. Then something happened that defied every rule, every protocol, every unspoken code of that sacred place. Something that hadn't happened in years, maybe decades. A tomb guard moved. Sergeant Eli Morgan, in full ceremonial uniform, standing sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier, his duty etched in stone, his movements rehearsed down to the millisecond, stepped off the mat. He broke formation. His boots hit the stone with purpose, not hesitation. The silence around them didn't just deepen. It became reverent. Before he ever wore the dress blues of a tomb guard, Eli had been a soldier. Just another grunt under the scorching, pitiless sun of Fallujah. He was boots on the ground with Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, deployed in one of the deadliest sectors during the height of the Iraq War. There were no off days, no breaks from the tension. Convoy after convoy, house after house, firefights were routine, more reality than anything Hollywood could ever dare depict. But in the thick of it all, there was one man who kept them steady, First Sergeant Harold Kemp. Kemp didn't command with volume. He didn't have to. His authority came from consistency. First in, last out, every single time. He moved with calm purpose, a presence so strong you felt it even when he wasn't in your line of sight. He never let the chaos strip away their humanity. He made sure his men remembered they were more than just uniforms. Eli, barely 22, had looked up to him like the father he never had. Home didn't send Eli letters. There were no birthdays remembered, no one waiting for him on the other side of the ocean, except Kemp. Kemp remembered. Kemp shared his rations, his silence, his faith. And when things went sideways, it was Kemp who made the ultimate choice. It was just supposed to be a routine check. An alley off Route Henry. Locals never used it, which was already a red flag. The squad moved in cautiously. Eli was near the front, eyes scanning the edges of the walls. Then everything erupted. A bomb buried in the rubble detonated with a force that turned the air into fire. Eli didn't even see the blast, just felt a sudden shove against his back, Kemp's hands throwing him to the ground. He hit the dirt hard, ears ringing, vision blurred. When he turned, Kemp was down. Blood soaked the sand beneath him, already too much. Eli screamed, begged for a medic, but deep down, he knew. Kemp's last words were barely audible, drowned by the chaos and the shouts of men trying to make sense of the moment. But Eli remembers them as clear as anything. Finish what we started. The war didn't end for Eli when he came home. The battlefield followed him, into dreams, into quiet corners of his mind that wouldn't stay silent. He tried civilian life, tried to breathe in peacetime, but even the 4th of July fireworks sent him collapsing in panic in a grocery store parking lot. Then one afternoon, lost and numb, he wandered into Arlington. Not as a tourist, but as a man looking for something he hadn't found since that day in Fallujah. He stood before the tomb of the unknown soldier and watched the flawless rhythm, the sacred silence, the devotion in every step. And something shifted. This wasn't performance. This was memory. This was honor. This was for Kemp, for every soldier whose body never made it home, whose name wasn't carved in granite. That day, Eli made a vow. He applied to become a tomb guard, a sentinel of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. The standards were brutal, the training was relentless. But each hour of pain, every command barked, every uniform ironed with precision, it was all a kind of healing. Each rifle polished, each step taken in total silence was for those who couldn't walk anymore. For Kemp, for the fallen, for the forgotten. Eli didn't take the post for glory. He took it because someone had once stood between him and death. He took it because silence could speak louder than words. And now, today, in the middle of that same sacred silence, Eli stepped off the mat for the first time in his service. Frank Riley was 74, but he still carried the weight of 19. His body was slower now, his knees stiff, his back bent. But nothing dulled the memories of 1968, the year Vietnam ripped away the last shreds of innocence. He had been just a Missouri farm boy, more familiar with feeding hogs than firing rifles, when the draft notice came. 2 weeks later, he was swallowed by the wet green hell of Quang Tri Province. Nothing dried out there. Not boots, not skin, not spirit. In war, it wasn't like the movies. There was no ceremony, no patriotic fanfare, just thick mud, suffocating heat, sweat slicked on every inch of skin, and the kind of fear that curled into your stomach and refused to leave. But in the middle of that chaos stood Private Dale Han. Somehow, even surrounded by the smoke and shouts of war, Dale made people believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it out alive. He was just a few months younger than Frank Riley, but there was a kind of old soul wisdom in him that made him seem years older. He stayed calm when bullets tore through the trees, made jokes that somehow cut through the noise, and never hesitated to hand over the last bit of his rations if someone else looked hungrier. He'd been born in Korea but moved to the U.S. as a baby. His parents had built a quiet life running a corner store in Oregon, and Dale would talk about them in the lulls between patrols. Sometimes he'd dream out loud about opening a shop of his own someday. Not a liquor store, he once clarified with a smirk, but a bookstore. A quiet place full of stories, not gunfire. Frank had laughed at that. Quiet felt like a myth to them, something you only found in memories or dreams. But through all the gunfire and monsoons, Dale became more than a comrade to Frank. He was a brother in every way but blood. They watched each other's backs during ambushes, sat shoulder to shoulder under battered tarps in the rain, and passed around letters from home like holy relics. They shared their hopes for life after the war, though neither of them dared say aloud whether they believed they'd actually get there. It ended on a day burned into Frank's memory like a scar. Their platoon was ambushed near a supply route. The sky cracked open with gunfire, and 2 men were hit, left exposed in the open, groaning in the dirt. The air was thick with smoke and metal and fear. Frank remembered the chaos, the sounds, the smell of blood and gun oil, and then Dale, silent and sure, sprinting into the line of fire. He hauled one wounded man back to cover, not stopping for even a second, and then turned to go back for the other. He never made it. A sniper's bullet caught him just as he was lifting the second soldier. Frank saw him drop, saw the flash of red, the way Dale crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Even 50 years later, that image still found him in his sleep. Dale was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for valor. Frank carried that medal with him ever since, not displayed on a mantle or polished for admiration, but kept quietly in a small wooden box buried deep in his old duffel bag. Tucked beside it was a photo, 2 young men in filthy uniforms grinning beneath a torn tarp. They weren't brothers by blood, but by war they were inseparable. Frank never married, never had children. He spent 3 decades working in a machine shop, kept to himself, and lived quietly. But the Bronze Star traveled with him, no matter where he moved. Not because it was his. He never believed that. It belonged to Dale, and to every soul who died so someone else could live. One night, long after the war, in a small apartment filled with silence, Frank opened the box for the first time in years. His hands, stiff with age, still moved with certainty. The metal lay there, dulled with time, but still weighty, still sacred. He thought of Dale's mother, the way she had clung to him at the funeral, tears streaking her face as she whispered, "Promise me they won't forget him." Frank had nodded. His throat had been too tight to speak. He hadn't forgotten. But he had done little else. That night, sitting alone with the memories, Frank made a choice. He would take the bronze star to the tomb of the unknown soldier. That solemn, silent place where words didn't matter, but remembrance did. He would place the medal there, not only for Dale, but for all the soldiers who never made it back. For the scared, brave boys who died far too young in mud and fire. Planning the trip took weeks. His knees were by him and his savings thin, but he found the cheapest motel near Arlington and packed light, just the basics, and the box. He didn't tell anyone, not because it was some grand secret, but because this wasn't something you shared. Some promises are yours alone to keep. On a crisp November morning, with a cane in one hand and the box in the other, Frank Riley made his way to the tomb. He didn't know how he'd make it up the steps, but he kept moving, pulled not by duty, but by something deeper. Love, memory, brotherhood, and a promise 55 years old. The sky above Arlington was flat gray, the kind of gray that settles into your bones and makes the air feel heavier. Frank stood just beyond the velvet rope, his fingers wrapped tightly around the box that had followed him through 5 different homes in countless years. Inside, the bronze star rested against worn velvet. The shine had faded, but its meaning hadn't. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stance, rigid spine, shaking cane, that faraway stare, said everything. Most people didn't notice. Tourists sipped lukewarm coffee. School groups shuffled by, whispering. But if anyone had stopped long enough to really look, they'd have seen a man holding not just a medal, but a lifetime of grief, love, and memory in a weathered hand. Frank stood among the murmuring crowd, a sea of middle school students clustered with their teachers, their voices low and subdued. Just 2 feet behind him, a pair of teenagers lounged against the stone barrier, earbuds dangling from their ears, boredom etched onto their faces like graffiti. Their presence was indifferent, detached. Frank stepped forward, just an inch, maybe 2. He only wanted to lean closer, to peer over the rope, maybe to whisper something into the space beyond it, or maybe say nothing at all. But balance wasn't something he could count on anymore. His cane slipped slightly on the damp stone, and he let out a small grunt as he caught himself. That's when the box slipped from his coat pocket. It hit the ground with a sharp, metallic clink. Not loud, but piercing, unmistakable. The bronze star inside tumbled across the stone plaza, spinning, catching the faint light, until it came to rest just past the boundary rope. Frank froze. He didn't even see it clearly at first. He felt it, in his chest, in his gut. That cold, heavy ache of something sacred lost. It wasn't just a box. It was Dale's memory. It was the promise. It was everything. His breath caught as his body moved instinctively. He bent at the knees, joints groaning under the weight of age and grief. His hand reached out, trembling in the morning chill, fingers hovering inches from the cold stone where the medal lay. Then the voice cut through the air. "Probably fake," one teenager said with a snort. The other chuckled, smirking. "Bet he got it off eBay." Frank didn't respond. His hand hung there in the air, suspended in a moment that felt endless, caught between action and humiliation. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, as if the shame itself had rooted him to the ground. A woman nearby snapped, "Hey, show some respect." Her words, though firm, were swallowed by the silence that followed, a silence so thick it felt like gravity, pressing down on everyone present. At the far end of the ceremonial platform, Sergeant Eli Morgan heard every word. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge the teenagers. His face remained locked in that look of unflinching discipline. His boots struck the stone in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, halt, turn, 21 steps again. Each movement refined by repetition, honed into something sacred. The sound of his stride was steady, precise, the rhythm of ceremony. But inside him, something shifted. He saw the old man in the denim jacket, saw the box on the ground, saw the pain etched so deeply into that weathered face. Eli knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror after Fallujah, the hollow ache of carrying too many names, too many memories that wouldn't rest. His gloved hand twitched slightly at his side. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. Tomb guards weren't supposed to act. Their job was to uphold the ritual, to remain unshaken by the world around them. They stood not for the living, but for the unknown, for those who never came home. They were symbols of silence and strength, guardians of memory. Eli had accepted that. But that thing lying on the ground wasn't just metal. It was a name, a promise, a story that hadn't yet been forgotten. In that glint of bronze, he saw First Sergeant Harold Kemp, the man who had shoved him to safety, who took the bullet that was meant for Eli. He still remembered the final breath, the way Kemp's eyes met his in that split second of understanding. He still wore Kemp's dog tag beneath his shirt. Every step he took in this uniform had been for men like him. And now he was watching another man, just as haunted, just as heavy with memory, being mocked for trying to keep a promise that the world had forgotten. No one else moved. No one else would. Eli's boots met the stone for the final step of his cycle. Step 21, he paused, turned, eyes forward, rifle perfectly balanced. On the outside, nothing in his posture changed, not a twitch, not a blink. He looked exactly like the sentinels who came before him, polished, unmoving, eternal. But inside was a war zone. There lay the metal, gleaming faintly on the cold stone, discarded or worse, dismissed. And beyond it, the old man still bent, still reaching, still frozen in that limbo between sorrow and dignity. Eli's training pounded in his mind. Do not move, do not speak, do not break formation. But then another voice rose through the noise of memory, a quieter voice, older, one that hadn't surfaced in years. You don't leave a man behind, not on the battlefield, not in life. It was Kemp's voice, calm, resolute, echoing through the dust and gunfire of that day in Fallujah. And suddenly that old battlefield felt very close. Eli's jaw clenched. The teenagers were quiet now. Their mockery had faded, but the wound it left was still raw, still bleeding in the silence. Still no one else moved. Still no one else saw what Eli saw. But Eli Morgan had made his choice. The code said, stay, but his conscience whispered, move. Eli had simply helped. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just an old man reaching towards something sacred. And a nation holding its breath behind velvet ropes. And then Eli did something no one had prepared for. He took a single step off the mat. His boots struck the stone ground with a weight that shattered the silence. A ripple of astonishment passed through the crowd like wind through wheat. A mother in the crowd leaned to her child and whispered, Is he moving? Her voice was shaky, uncertain. Another step followed, then another. Eli crossed a line that wasn't marked but deeply understood, an invisible threshold dividing ceremonial duty from raw human response. He moved with deliberate calm, not rushing, as if even this unplanned act somehow belonged in the sacred order of his post, as if reverence in its truest form demanded action. He came to where the metal lay, a bronze star glinting faintly under the gray sky, and knelt, slowly, gently. With hands trained to perfection and a heart moved by something older than rules, he picked it up like it could shatter in his grasp, and then he turned to face the old man who had dropped it. Frank Riley stood frozen, his eyes watery and wet, disbelief etched into the lines of his face. His arm hung half-raised in the air, fingers twitching slightly as if they were caught between reaching and retreating. Unsure whether they dared hope, Eli stepped closer and extended the metal, gloved hand outstretched. His voice was soft but steady. It didn't need volume. It carried the weight of truth. It belongs to him, he said, not the ground. Frank blinked, his mouth opened, then closed again, closed. And finally, slowly, he took the metal. His hand closed around it like he was holding a living thing, something warm and beating. That's Dale's, he said in a cracked whisper. I thought I'd lost him again. Eli looked directly into his eyes. He's not lost, sir, he said with quiet certainty. Not while you remember him. Then, breaking every rule in the book, Eli raised his right hand in a crisp, reverent salute. It wasn't part of any drill. It wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. achingly real. Behind them, the crowd remained still. No applause, no noise, just silence, deep and raw, stretched out like a held breath. Eli turned and walked slowly back across the stone, each step echoing in a space that suddenly felt different, charged. He returned to his place, boots striking stone once more. The ceremony resumed, the sacred rhythm restored. But something had changed. That day, Sergeant Eli Morgan broke protocol. But in breaking it, he upheld something far older than any rulebook: honor. And the nation would not forget. Far in the back, a college student named Isla Barnes lifted her phone and hit record. She didn't know why. She hadn't even planned to be at Arlington that morning. Her professor had mentioned extra credit for attending a Veterans Day event, and she'd come mostly for the points. She'd been standing toward the back of the crowd, scrolling mindlessly through social media, only half aware of the ceremony. Until the sound of a single boot striking stone broke through her haze. She looked up, puzzled. The tomb guard was moving, but not in rotation, not part of the drill. He was walking with purpose toward an old man who looked like he might collapse. And then, he knelt. Isla's thumb hit record without her even thinking. The clip she captured lasted just 43 seconds, but within hours, it would move the country. That afternoon, Isla posted the video to Instagram. She captioned it, "He broke formation to pick up a bronze star. This is what honor looks like. Hashtag Arlington, hashtag tomb guard, hashtag honor." By evening, the video had racked up more than 300,000 views. By the next morning, it had passed 2 million. Headlines flooded social media. Tomb guard breaks protocol, wins nation's heart. Unprecedented act of compassion at Arlington. But not everyone was applauding. Across the road at Fort Myer, Sergeant Eli Morgan sat stiffly in a plain, gray-walled room. The air was tense. His uniform was immaculate, creases sharp, shoes gleaming, but his eyes betrayed the weariness of someone who had stood too long in judgment. Seated beside him were his commanding officer and 2 senior NCOs. Captain Raymond Sykes, head of ceremonial operations for the 3rd Infantry Regiment, looked like a man at war, with his duty, with his conscience. Sergeant Morgan said, his voice clipped and formal, "You are aware that stepping off the mat during duty is a direct violation of Sentinel protocol." "Yes, sir," Eli responded. His voice was unwavering. "You also spoke while in uniform, engaged a civilian, broke ceremonial bearing." "Yes, sir." "Explain your actions." Eli drew in a steady breath. "The medal belonged to a soldier who died in combat. The man receiving it was his father." Eli stood frozen for just a moment longer, boots firmly planted on the sacred black mat that marked the path of his duty. No one else moved. The crowd remained hushed, breath held, watching. But Eli couldn't just stand there. Not when a brother in arms, though decades older and no longer in uniform, had dropped his bronze star, and no one had lifted a finger. That medal wasn't a trinket. It was a lifetime, a memory, a sacrifice. It didn't belong lying on the cold concrete like discarded litter. Without thinking, Eli had stepped off his post. Now seated before Captain Sykes, he faced the consequences. The silence in the room was taut. Sykes, composed and severe, finally spoke. "Your job is to represent perfection, Sergeant. The tomb demands absolute discipline, no deviation." Eli met his superior's gaze without flinching. "With respect, sir," he said steadily, "the tomb represents sacrifice. That man and his friend, they're part of what we guard. I didn't break the code to dishonor it. I stepped out because the moment called for something more than stillness." For a long time, Sykes didn't say a word. Then a voice came from across the room, a weathered sergeant major, his uniform ribboned with commendations, a silver star from Desert Storm shining on his chest. He gave Eli a barely there nod, subtle but deeply telling. Sykes folded his hands on the desk. "You're on administrative review, effective immediately, pending final decision." Eli stood tall, saluted, and walked out of the room. He didn't expect praise, nor did he crave it. That wasn't why he'd acted. But as he stepped down the gray concrete steps outside headquarters, someone was waiting. Corporal Rene Vega leaned against the wall in a long winter overcoat, beret neat, hair tucked tight, eyes focused directly on him. A fellow sentinel, a second year, known for her flawless composure. "You knew they'd come down on you," she said, her voice low. "I did. But you still did it anyway." Eli turned his gaze toward the distant cemetery gates. He carried that medal for 50 years. I wasn't about to let it die on the pavement. She stepped closer, shoulder to shoulder. "We're not supposed to move." "I know." Silence hung between them. "I would have done it too," Renee said after a moment. "Or at least I hope I would have." Eli looked at her, steady and calm. "I wasn't sure until the second I moved, but once I did, I didn't regret it." Renee gave a thoughtful nod, reached into her coat and pulled out her phone. "You've seen this, right?" He didn't have to look. He already knew. The video had gone everywhere. His precise salute, the old man's trembling hands. That moment, still and powerful, caught on camera. A freeze frame of silent dignity. "They're calling you a hero," Renee said softly. "I'm just a guard," Eli replied. She gave the faintest smile. "Maybe, but not just any guard." By nightfall, the clip had gone national. Cable networks aired it on repeat. Talk shows dissected it. Veterans groups lit up with support. A VF Padu post in Michigan posted a picture of their members saluting the screen. A room full of weathered men and women standing as one. But Eli didn't read the comments, didn't count the views. He sat on the edge of his bunk, slowly polishing his boots. His gaze lingered on a small frame photo on the shelf. First Sergeant Harold Kemp, caught mid-laugh in the dusty Fallujah sun. In his shirt pocket, Eli carried Kemp's dog tag. It wasn't just memorabilia. It was grounding. A weight that reminded him who he was, where he'd been, and what he stood for. He didn't feel shame, not fear, just a steady, quiet certainty. He hadn't broken the ritual. He had reminded the world why it existed. The video, barely a minute long, had already carved its way into hearts across the country by the time sunlight spilled across Arlington the next morning. What had begun as a quiet act, a guard stepping off his sacred mat to return a fallen Bronze Star to an aging veteran, had ignited something bigger than anyone expected. Online forums and communities surged with responses. Veterans, many who hadn't spoken of their service in years, suddenly opened up. One former Green Beret wrote, "That wasn't just a medal, that was a memory. And that guard, he didn't break protocol. He honored it in the purest way." Well, a Vietnam vet posted a photo of his own Bronze Star, captioned, "Haven't taken this out in 30 years. Watching that moment reminded me why I earned it." Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Thread after thread filled with stories. Faded medals photographed with trembling hands. The names of fallen brothers typed with reverence. Over and over, the same sentiment echoed. He did what we all wish someone would have done for us. And it didn't stop with veterans. Classrooms across the nation shifted their lesson plans. History teachers played the clip in silence, then asked a simple question. "What do you think this means?" Students wrote essays, some poetic, others raw and blunt, all reaching for something deeper than facts or protocol. A seventh grader in Indiana penned a line that stood out among the rest. "He didn't move to break the rules. He moved to remember someone who mattered." The medal wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of something far greater. It stood for sacrifice, for memory, and for promises kept long after anyone remembered them being made. Eli Morgan saluted it not because protocol demanded it, but because his heart did. That simple gesture rippled out far beyond the white stones of Arlington. In a quiet high school classroom in Arizona, a student turned that moment into words. Her essay, titled "When Silence Speaks Louder Than Orders," began as a school assignment. But after her teacher posted it online, it resonated deeply. Over 50,000 shares in just a few days. Art teachers across the country picked up the story and urged their students to draw what they felt. Soon, social media feeds bloomed with hand-drawn sketches and paintings capturing the moment. Some were pencil, some watercolor. One young girl chose to draw it on paper cut from a folded American flag. In Ohio, at a small community college, a mural started to form on a red brick wall. The image, Eli Morgan mid-salute, the Bronze Star gleaming at the center. Beneath the mural in bold, defiant letters, "Honor doesn't stand still." Just 72 hours after it all began, a retired Navy chaplain launched a petition online. Its title was plain-spoken but powerful. Commend Sergeant Eli Morgan for restoring the spirit of service. At first, the petition circulated in tight-knit veteran groups and college alumni forums. But then it started to move fast. Celebrities began reposting it. No captions, no fanfare. Just a quote from Eli. "It belongs to him, not the ground." A country singer added it to her Instagram story. A former NFL quarterback shared it to his 2 million followers. A prominent journalist who had lost his brother in Afghanistan simply reposted the link. By the fifth day, the petition had passed 400,000 signatures. These weren't idle clicks. They came with deeply personal messages. "My father served in Korea. He would have wept seeing this. I never met my grandfather, but I know he would have stood and saluted. This is the America I want my children to grow up in." Television anchors began quoting lines from the moment like excerpts from historic speeches. Daytime talk shows ran segments titled "When Rules Yield to Compassion" and "Tradition versus Humanity." But to those who had worn the uniform, there was no debate, no confusion. The meaning was clear. At a rural VFW post in Georgia, a group of elderly veterans met quietly one night. They hadn't worn their medals in years. But that evening, they pinned them back on, stood together, and posed for a photo. Its caption read simply, "Because one guard remembered." Eli Morgan never sought attention. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. But the nation saw more than him. It saw itself. It saw a part of its spirit that had been waiting to wake up. A longing, a memory, a truth too often buried under ceremony and protocol. That sometimes real honor means choosing to move. Even when the rule book says, "Stand still." 10 days later, Arlington felt different. Not silent, reverent. There was no public notice, but somehow the right people knew. Veterans arrived, families, teachers, students who had written about it, drawn it, posted it. They came quietly, dressed in coats and hats heavy with patches and legacy. At precisely 11:00 a.m., the tomb guard changed, crisp and precise as always. But then something shifted. For the first time in years, the sacred black mat was cleared. A podium was placed, modest, dignified, near the plaza's edge. An Army brigadier general stepped forward, his chest a mosaic of ribbons. Behind him stood Sergeant Eli Morgan, in full dress blues, still and solemn. At his side was Frank Riley, spine straighter than anyone had seen, hands behind his back, eyes forward. The general's speech was short but full of weight. He spoke not just of duty and rank, but of memory, the kind etched into silence and into the gleam of medals long put away. Then he turned to Eli and handed him a velvet box. Eli stepped forward. He didn't open it immediately. He turned first to Frank, the man who had once stood trembling and ashamed. Now that same man stood steady, his shame transformed into something deeper. Dignity. Eli opened the box and took out a silver medallion hanging from a blue ribbon. He looked Frank in the eye. "In recognition," he said, "of a life lived in quiet service, and a promise kept across half a century, it is my honor to present you with the civilian commendation for valor." Eli's voice didn't falter. But Frank's hands did as he reached forward to accept the medal. The crowd held its breath, then released it with soft applause. And then, something no one had expected happened. Frank accepted the microphone with a gentle nod, his hand trembling slightly as he took it from the general. For a long moment he didn't speak. He simply stood there looking out over the gathered crowd, some in military dress, others in everyday clothes, some old, some impossibly young. The silence was thick but respectful. Then his gaze dropped to the small, shining object in his hand. "My name," he began, voice low but clear, "is Frank." A pause. Frank Dale Hahn. The crowd quieted even more, as if the weight of his words demanded stillness. "He was my best friend," Frank continued, a hush falling over the lawn like a blanket. "He died when he was just 19, saving lives in a jungle most of you have probably never even heard of." Frank looked down again, the metal glinting in the light. "For years, I carried his bronze star. I didn't know what else to do with the grief. It sat with me day after day, not just as a reminder of his bravery, but of everything we lost with him." His voice cracked. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. But now it doesn't feel like it's just mine to carry anymore. He turned slightly, lifting his hand and gesturing toward Eli. This young man didn't just pick up a medal, Frank said, voice steadier now, resonating with something larger than himself. He picked up a promise, a sacred one, and he carried it the way soldiers carry each other. When one falls, the other keeps walking. Frank didn't speak another word. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was more powerful than any speech. Eli turned toward the tomb. His movements were slow, deliberate, every step precise, almost ceremonial. When he reached the base, he knelt without a sound, pulling a single white rose from his jacket and laying it gently at the foot of the tomb. It wasn't a move dictated by protocol. There was no manual for that kind of gesture, but the meaning echoed across the crowd like a thunderclap. "For all of them," he said, barely louder than a whisper. Applause followed, but not the kind born of celebration. It was reverent, measured. A few people stood, some saluted, many wept quietly. A little girl near the front squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "I want to be like them." And something changed that day, not just for Frank, not just for Eli, but for everyone who witnessed it. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that a medal is never just a piece of metal. It's a name, a life, a story, that Dale Hahn mattered it, that the invisible line separating soldier from civilian, between rigid duty and quiet compassion, sometimes needs to be blurred in the name of honor, and that sometimes a single step forward, like the one Eli took, can carry the weight of generations behind it. Frank Riley passed away not long after, on a gentle spring morning as the first blooms brushed the grass outside his small apartment in Arlington. There were no sirens, no frantic rush to the hospital, just stillness. A window was open, letting in the breeze. On the nightstand beside him sat a photo of two young soldiers. Next to it, cradled gently in Frank's hand, was the Bronze Star. He passed as he had lived in his later years, with grace and silence, carrying the memory of his friend like a sacred trust. The funeral was held in a quiet Virginia church. There were no TV crews, no front-page headlines, but the pews were filled to the last row. Veterans from every war wore their pressed uniforms. Young ROTC cadets stood at attention. Teachers who had shared Frank's story with students brought classrooms of kids with drawings folded under their arms. At the very front, standing alone but unwavering, was Sergeant Eli Morgan. He wore full-dress blues, white gloves folded across his waist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the final note of taps rang out, echoing like a held breath through the sanctuary, Eli stepped forward. He raised his hand in a crisp, solemn salute, not for show, not for ceremony, but for the man who had carried a promise longer than most people stay standing. Frank was laid to rest with full military honors. The fact that the medal he bore wasn't officially his no longer mattered. What mattered was everything he had carried in his heart, and the people who finally saw it. After the service ended, as others began to leave, Eli remained. He walked to Frank's grave alone and rested his gloved hand gently on the polished stone. Frank's name was there now, etched cleanly beneath it, only two words. He remembered. Later that same day, back in Arlington, the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier resumed his post. Tourists passed through the cemetery gates as they always did, quiet, cameras slung around their necks, eyes wide with reverence. A little boy, walking hand in hand with his mother, stopped. He stared at the lone guard pacing silently. 21 steps. Pause. 21 steps again. The child tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why does he only move sometimes?" She crouched beside him and looked into his eyes. "Because," she said gently, "he only moves when it matters." Eli heard her words. His expression didn't change. His steps never faltered. But something stirred deep within him, beneath the uniform, beneath the precision, beneath the long weight of his duty. He felt them, and as he marched on, boots tapping the stone, eyes fixed ahead, he carried more than just the ritual. He carried Frank's memory. He carried Dale's sacrifice. And he carried the quiet. Some promises age with time, but never lose their weight. Some footsteps are more than just part of a ritual. They carry stories, names, and sacred bonds. When boots touch the ground in reverence, they echo with memories of lives given in jungles thick with heat and danger. Deserts that stretched beyond the horizon, in foreign cities whose names history barely recalls, but whose sacrifices laid the foundation of the freedom we now stand on without thinking. When Sergeant Eli Morgan stepped off that ceremonial mat, it wasn't only about returning a medal, it was about restoring something deeper. A moment that mattered, a voice long silenced, a man nearly lost to time. That step was not symbolic. It was deliberate, weighted with the truth that some friendships do not end with war, and some duties do not expire with discharge. Frank Riley's journey didn't end the day he offered a salute. It came to its quiet but powerful close with a country remembering someone it had once forgotten. Private Dillon, Frank's best friend. A name that might have stayed buried under years of dust and silence, if not for one soldier who chose to move, to speak, to act. One step, one decision, and an entire legacy was pulled from the shadows. That's what one gesture can do. That's the ripple of remembering. Because every uniform hides a story. Every medal carries a breath, a heartbeat, a life lived for something more. And sometimes the most heroic acts don't happen on the battlefield. They happen years later, in a town square, on a front porch, or in a comment section, when someone chooses not to forget. So ask yourself, who in your town has gone unseen for too long? Is there a quiet soul behind a window, a flag hanging just above eye level? Who never shares what they witnessed? A woman who returned from service and simply faded into the rhythm of everyday life? A name we once knew but now struggle to recall? Say their name in the comments. Don't let their story vanish. Like this video if you believe some stories still deserve to be told, even when the world has stopped asking. Subscribe to this channel to honor those who serve not for glory, but from a sense of duty. Tap the bell so you never miss a chance to stand witness to the quiet heroes. Because history doesn't only live in textbooks, it lives in the stillness of folded flags, in the echo of boots across old streets, in the weight of memories passed down through generations. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in a salute, but always, always worth remembering.